I'm here to try to show you that your argument that there is no such thing as Reformed Egyptian is simply wrong. And I have the proof.
I'm studying Reformed Egyptian while I'm enjoying the power and beauty of nature in my backyard. The Egyptian has changed from hieroglyphic to demotic to hieratic. As the wind and the water changes the landscape, so time has changed, or reformed Egyptian. The Nephites also changed the Egyptian, which they called among themselves the Reformed Egyptian. It's not a world language that's available for all scholars, but it is a very real language which was changed by the lineage of the record keepers. The world never had this language, but that doesn't mean it's fake. It's very real.
The internal evidence and the understanding of the Book of Mormon on Reformed Egyptian is described in the Echoes and Evidences of the Book of Mormon, edited by Don Perry, Dan Peterson, and John W. Welch. This is out of the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies for 2002. What they noted was Moroni taught that while his people still used the Hebrew language, so we know the Hebrew was available for them, Mormon's abridgment of their records had been written in Reformed Egyptian, Mormon 9, 32, and 33. Nephi, whose writings became the pattern for the records 1,000 years earlier, he wrote, "Yea, I make a record in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. And I know that the record which I make is true, and I make it with mine own hand, and I make it according to my knowledge." That's 1 Nephi 1, 2, and 3. It was not until the 20th century that ancient Hebrew texts written in Egyptian script became known to scholars. We now have a number of Northwest Semitic texts, Hebrew, or else they are related to Hebrew, in Egyptian magical papyri. These are mostly incantations that, instead of being translated, they are merely transcribed in hieratic. Hieratic is a cursive or a reformed version of the hieroglyphic characters most people think of as Egyptian writing. The underlying language, however, is an early form of the Hebrew Canaanite language. The texts are found on the London Magical Papyrus, 14th century BC, so this is quite a few centuries before Lehi existed, the Harris Magical Papyrus from the 13th century BC, the Papyrus Anastasi I from the 13th century BC, and Ostrakhan 25759 in the 11th century BC. The latter is interesting because the text on one side is purely Egyptian hieratic, while the text on the other side is an early form of Hebrew that is written in the hieratic characters. All of these documents were discovered and translated long after the Book of Mormon was actually published. Of particular interest is Amherst Papyrus 63. This is a document of the 4th century BC written in a cursive, a reformed Egyptian script called demotic, because they had taken the hieroglyphs and they began writing quick little cursive notes, as it were, out of the hieroglyphs, and they called it demotic. The underlying language of this papyrus Amherst, however, is Hebrew, even though it is written in a reformed Egyptian. This is a direct archaeological discovery of a reformed Egyptian language being written in Hebrew. It is actually in Aramaic, which is a sister language to Hebrew. Among the writings included in the religious text is a version of Psalms 20, verses 2 through 6. An Ostrakhan uncovered at the ancient Judean site of Arad in 1967, and dating to the time of Lehi, has a text that, although written in a combination of 10 Egyptian hieratic and 7 Hebrew characters, can be read entirely as Egyptian. Other texts of the same period, that commingle Hebrew and Egyptian scripts were discovered during the archaeological excavations at Tel Ein Kudaira, the biblical Kadesh Barnea, and in the Sinai Peninsula near the border of ancient Judah during the latter half of the 1970s. To most of Joseph Smith's contemporaries, the term Reformed Egyptian seemed to be so much nonsense. Alexander Campbell, who wrote the first critical book of the Book of Mormon, scoffed at the fact that it had been translated from the Reformed Egyptian. He even put in 3 exclamation points. Many critics still suggest that despite long-standing evidence to the contrary, that there is no such thing as Reformed Egyptian, and insist that no ancient Israelite would have written sacred scripture using Egyptian. We now know that the opposite is exactly the archaeological state of the nature of the language. Now, I've made videos before on Reformed Egyptian. They're ignoring those, but I have now found several more sources that I didn't use the first couple of videos that I'm going to also share with you. And I'm going to show you without question, Reformed Egyptian is for real. It was already taught back in 1967 by none other than Hugh W. Nibley, one of the greatest of the LDS scholars. He noted in his book Since Cumorah, now this is the second reprint, the second edition for 1988. He showed this in 1967 because it absolutely shows without doubt that Reformed Egyptian existed. On page 149. In matters of language and composition, the Book of Mormon from the very first presented a welcome target to the critics. Here was something that even a child could see was fraudulent. Something that no intelligent person whatsoever in the world, let alone a clever deceiver, would even dream of. And what was the subject? Reformed Egyptian. What a farcical farce. Well, nobody knew anything about Reformed Egyptian in Joseph Smith's day. But we do now. Now, for critics to take the stance of the 1830s about the nature of the scriptures and reality and history and archaeology, and to continue arguing from that time period, you're woefully out of date. Way out of date. It's a new millennium. It's 2010. It's time for you to hop on it just a little bit. Because I am flooding YouTube with evidence for the Book of Mormon. Direct, historical, religious, and archaeological, cultural, linguistic, etymological, and philosophical evidence. If you can't see it, you're not watching it when you're awake. The word demotic. It's a word and a name of a particular style of language that people in Joseph Smith's day didn't know, but it's a fairly common thing nowadays. So, even our LDS Egyptologists such as John Gee and Michael Dennis Rhodes and now Kerry Mullenstein, they're teaching we LDS about the evolution of the Egyptian language. I don't know where you anti-Mormon critics are getting your weird concepts, but you're obviously not keeping up with the evidence. Demotic is a peculiar and remarkably abbreviated style of cursive writing developed out of the hieratic by systematic abbreviation from the 8th to the 4th centuries. Now, the main time frame that it was at its peak and international popularity was in Lehi's own time. Long ago, it was pointed out that the peculiar writing known as Meroitic, which is a still baffling and largely undeciphered Egyptian script, and it came out of the Demotic under circumstances remarkably paralleling and purported development of Nephite writing. Meroitic has the most striking affinities to the characters of our so-called Anthon transcript, which is thought to be Joseph Smith's own copying of a sample of the writing on the plates. The entire point is, with the Demotic, with the Meroitic, and with the Anthon transcripts, is there really was such writing